For tens of thousands of Americans and Canadians alike, hunting is not just a pastime. It's a way of life. It's a way to put food on the table. It's a way to enjoy the great outdoors. And all of these men and women, they know that every time they set off out into the woods, they're not at the top of the food chain. And a lot of them, they well go prepared to handle anything that nature can throw at them. And for the two fellows in today's story, even though they had decades of experience out in the woods, absolutely nothing could have prepared them for what happened to them on this particular trip. But before we get to that encounter, if you've had an encounter or know a story you'd like to have shared here on the show, please email me at the link below. If you like today's story, gently slap that like button. And if you haven't done so already, especially if you're a return viewer, hit that subscribe button. While you're at it, slam that notification bell. And if you haven't done so already, check out the podcast. I'll put a link in the description below for that. Now, let's get into today's encounter. Cousins Robert and Tom were born in 1975, just a few days apart, and they grew up in northern Michigan. And from a very young age, these two guys, they had a very unique upbringing. From the time that they were about 5 or 6 years old, they already knew how to shoot. You see, their fathers had both served in the Vietnam War. They were part of the United States Marine Corps. So growing up, their fathers taught them a lot of stuff that they learned in the Corps and a lot of survival tactics that they learned serving overseas in Vietnam. And they spent a lot of time with these boys out in the woods. They would take them hunting from a very young age. They taught them different edible plants. They taught them basically how to live off the land. And this was a skill set that both Robert and Tom carried with them all the way through their teen years, through their 20s, all the way up until they were grown adults. Robert and Tom, they were cousins, but they were more than just that. They were best friends and they were like brothers. These two guys did everything together. Wherever one of them would go, the other one would go as well. And their number one passion in life was hunting. Now, these guys, they were not weekend warrior hunter types. They were not just going off into the deer woods in the fall. These guys, they would travel across the U.S., up into Canada, up into Alaska, hunting various species. They had hunted rams up in British Columbia. They had hunted moose up in Alaska. They even hunted Kodiak brown bears up in Alaska as well. These guys were no strangers to the woods. It was a place that they just felt at home. It was something that they loved to do, and nothing at all would ever stop them from doing that. As they got a little bit older, started to have their own families, the two of them, they started to realize that their days of traveling across North America hunting big game, that was slowly coming to an end, at least for the time being until their children grew up. But the two cousins, they did not want to give up hunting. So the two of them together, they ended up purchasing about 200 acres up in northern Michigan, somewhere that they could just escape to on the weekend. They can go do some shooting, enjoy time together, and somewhere where they could go target their number one game species, which was white-tailed deer. They took possession of the property in early spring, and through the rest of that spring, through the summer, they spent as much time as possible out at the property, looking for deer sign, trying to pattern the deer, and also setting up a hunting camp. They decided that they weren't going to build a big hunting cabin, not this year. They just spent way too much money on this property. So they decided for their camp, they were just going to set up a trailer. So they ended up looking around online, and they found an old, fairly rough condition Flying Dutchman trailer. So they brought that out to the property, and they ended up setting it up close to this old rundown homestead. It was the only spot on this property that made sense for them to set up camp. If they set it up anywhere else, they figured it would affect the deer movement, and this was the perfect place. Even though it was a little creepy setting it up by the ruins of this old homestead, and even though they joked about it, it really did not bother these two cousins. They weren't scared of pretty much anything, and it was just something that they just did not think of. They just kind of teased each other about setting this trailer up right by that. They would bug each other, telling them that ghosts were going to get them at night. But it was all just in fun. They really did not mean anything by it. They really did not even believe in that type of stuff at all either. Through that fall, they spent a lot of time out on the property hunting. Through that first year, they only had managed to tag a couple of animals, And after that, these two cousins, they start to discuss how they could develop this property into being like a prized property of harvesting giant white-tailed deer. And they started thinking of ways on how to manage the herd and how to manage the genetics in the area. They came up with a plan that they were going to set up food plots at various points across this 200-acre property and try to bring deer onto the property and hold them in that area. So they talked to one of their friends that had a whole bunch of farming equipment and a bunch of tractors, and that spring they ended up clearing trails all through the property, and they made various clearings that were about 75 yards across, 125 yards long, and in each one of these clearings they planted a different type of crop. They planted alfalfa in one, soybeans in another, corn off in another one, and then along these food plots they set various tree stands, and then all to the property they pretty much just littered the property with trail cameras, trying to get a feel for all the deer and trying to really lure them onto those food plots. Through the summer they spent a lot of time out scouting through the early fall, and that year during deer season they were stoked. They had a couple of real nice bucks on camera, they had their target bucks all set out, and they were really looking forward to that season. One season finally rolled around. The two cousins, they made their way out to their property, loaded up their trailer with everything they needed, and they were set to be out there for 2 weeks. They were not coming home until they got their trophy bucks. The very first morning of the hunt, the two cousins, they decided, based on the wind, that they were going to be hunting the small clearing of alfalfa over on the far one side of the property. Tom, he was actually going to sit up in a stand along the alfalfa, and Robert, he was going to go along this dry creek bed about 150 yards just east of that alfalfa field, where there was a really heavy trail. They had actually pinpointed a very big bedding location just off past that creek bed. So the two cousins, they made their way into their stands. Tom went up in the stand along the alfalfa, and Rob, very slowly, very quietly in the dark, he weaseled his way through the trees to that dry creek bed. He went down to the bottom, went up the other side, climbed up in his stand, and he settled in for the morning's hunt as well. That day, something felt a little bit off. They did not really see anything, and just the area just had this weird, heavy feeling to it. There was no noise in the area, no sounds of birds, no sounds of squirrels. It was just really off. And both cousins, they felt this, and they actually radioed over to each other on walkie-talkies, basically saying like, hey, is something up over in your area? Like, it's super quiet over here. And both cousins did translate that to each other, that the area did feel off, that something just did not feel right. After the morning's hunt, the two cousins, they decided they were going to go start to pull some of the cards from their trail cameras. So the two cousins, they made their way through the woods, going to their various camera locations. And when they got to the very first one, they both kind of stopped, looking at this tree that they did have a camera on, but the camera was gone. There was just the strap hanging off the side of the tree. There were small shards of plastic sitting on the ground. But what really stood out to both of them was the fact that where the camera had been sitting on this tree, they could see these really deep claw marks right down through the middle of the tree. Both cousins are looking at these marks, and both of them at the same time, the first thought that popped into their head was that it was a bear. Now, they had never had a picture of a bear on the property, but just judging by these claw marks, that was the only thing they could come up with. Tom even looked over at Robert and said, "Do you think that's from a bear?" And Robert basically told Tom, like, there's nothing else it could be. There's nothing else that big out here. Nothing with claws like that. Like, this has to be a bear. The two cousins, they kind of picked up all the shards of their camera, grabbed the strap from the tree, and started making their way towards where they had another camera. When they got to that camera, which was only really about 80 yards away, that camera too was gone. And this time they could not find any parts of it at all. They looked all around on the ground. There was no strap, no parts of the camera, and no sign of anything in the area at all. There were no claw marks on that tree. There were no footprints on the ground. But both cousins at this point were starting to really wonder what the hell was going on and what they were dealing with. Again, both cousins thought, just based on that first camera, that there was a bear, and it's not uncommon for a bear to go after trail cameras, especially if you have any form of scent on your hands. If you just finish eating and you put a camera up on a tree, a bear will smell that, it will go to it, and a lot of times they will destroy cameras. Both of them at this point, they were confused, but they were also kind of pissed off because cameras were not cheap, and now that's one camera that was destroyed and one camera that's just completely missing. But the two cousins, they carried on going to check more of their cameras, and 3 out of the 4 next cameras that they checked, just like that second camera, they were just gone. That fourth camera though, the fourth camera was okay. They ended up pulling the camera card out, they put a new card in, and they decided when they got back home, they were going to check that card. That evening, they sat pretty much in the same spots, and again, through that hunt, the entire area was just completely silent, and it actually did make both cousins feel pretty uneasy, especially Robert, who was down by that creek bed. As he's sitting up in his tree, he's just listening to everything around him, and there's just no sound whatsoever aside from the wind blowing leaves across the ground. And that was incredibly odd because every single time they would scout that area, they would see multiple deer. And every time before, when they would check their trail cameras, they would have a ton of picture of deer crossing pretty much right underneath his stand. So this just did not make sense. It was something that he just had never experienced in his 30 years of hunting. He had never experienced a silence like that, and just the complete lack of pretty much life in the area. Once sun had set, the two cousins, they climbed down out of their stands, met up with each other. They made the walk all the way back to the trailer. And that night, sitting there eating their dinner, the two of them, they were talking about just how weird that day was, just how the lack of movement, the lack of life, the lack of sound, and their cameras being destroyed, being missing, just how weird all of that was. And both of them actually admitted to each other that they were actually kind of creeped out. They were a little bit concerned. They just did not know what to make of that situation. They decided that the next day they were not going to go hunt that alfalfa field. They were going to move and they were going to go hunt over by their soybeans. The next morning they got up, they made their way over to the soybeans, and that day, instead of splitting off hunting 2 separate stands, they actually sat together right on the edge of the beans up in a double ladder stand. And that morning, just like the day before, they saw no deer whatsoever. Now that morning was different. They did hear small animals, small game rustling through the leaves. They could hear birds, and it did not have that same feeling as it did over by the alfalfa and that creek bed. But it still was odd that they just were not seeing deer. They always saw deer on this property, and it was just not making sense to them. That afternoon, they spent a little bit of time kind of scouting through the rest of their property, just kind of walking some of those trails that they made. And they started to notice that there was not a lot of fresh deer sign. And they started to really attribute this lack of deer sign to those claw marks on the tree, figuring that a big bear had moved into the area, and that was more than likely keeping the deer away, especially any does with fawns. And both Robert and Tom at that point decided they needed to get rid of this bear. They couldn't shoot it right now, but they knew they had to get rid of it. So they came up with a plan that they would actually try to find where this bear was on the property, and they were going to try to scare it off the property in hopes that it would not come back. So that evening, instead of going sitting up in their deer stands, the two of them, they basically walked side by side over towards the corn. They set up just outside the corn, hoping that this bear would actually come out of the corn. They knew that out of all those crops, the corn was the most likely to actually hold bear. So they set up right outside of it. Their plan was, if this bear came out, they were just going to make as much noise as possible. They would just start shooting. They knew that ran the risk of scaring the deer away, but they really wanted to make sure that this bear would not come back to the property. They sat there right until dark, and there was no sign of a bear at all. And in fact, while they were sitting there, they did actually see a couple of does with fawns actually moving into the corn to go feed. So the two cousins started to really think, like, what is happening? Like, there's something on the property. It's a big bear that's keeping the deer away, but the one spot where the bear would most likely be, it's not there. And that's actually where the deer are going. Something's just not adding up here. So when they got back to their trailer, the two cousins, they really tried to brainstorm, like, what else could this be? Like, it's not a bear, because obviously the bear's not in the corn. That's where the deer are going, and that's the most likely place for a bear. So what else could this be? They were trying to figure out what other type of animal this could be. Robert, during this process of kind of brainstorming what type of animal, started to feel a little on edge, just thinking about what could be out there. He was not a real strong believer in the paranormal or anything cryptid related, but just based on some experiences he had on their various hunting trips all across North America, he was a little bit more open to the idea of something different, something unexplained being out there than Tom was. Robert, feeling a little bit on edge, decided that from this point on, every time he left the trailer, he was taking his rifle with him. If that meant waking up in the middle of the night, going out to their small homemade outhouse, he was taking his rifle. It was something he had never even double thought before. He never had any issues going off into the dark. But something about this situation just really did not sit well with him. And sure enough, that night, about 2:30 in the morning, Robert woke up with his stomach rumbling, and he knew he had to go use a washroom, and he could not use a washroom in the trailer. That was one rule that they had. You did not use a washroom in the trailer because it would just basically stink up the trailer. So Robert, he grabbed his rifle, he made his way over to the door, he opened it up, made the short walk, only about 20 yards, over to their homemade outhouse, which really was just a bucket with a tarp against a couple of trees. That was it. Just something to shield you from the wind. It was one of those buckets with a toilet seat on top, and that was it. So he made his way over to this bucket, sat down, did his business, and partway through, all of a sudden he could hear something moving in the trees, and it sounded like it was pretty big. Robert reaches for his flashlight, points it up, shines it in the direction where he heard this noise, and he hears nothing else. It almost just, the area just went completely silent. Robert really starts to feel himself at this point start to get nervous. He can feel his heart rate picking up. He kind of reaches over with his other hand, kind of pulls his rifle closer to him as he's sitting there on that bucket, and he's just holding his light and listening. When all of a sudden he could hear what sounds like claws on the bark of a tree, and it sounds like whatever this is, it's climbing. So Robert at this point's like, this was a bear. It's climbing a tree because now I've shone my light in that direction. It scared it. Now it's going up a tree. Okay, this is completely fine. This is nothing I haven't dealt with before. So really quickly, Robert finishes his business, grabs his rifle, holds his flashlight back up, and as he's shining it in the direction where he heard that sound, when he notices that there's all these dead leaves falling down from the tree, so he turns his flashlight up into the tree, and then he immediately freezes. In front of him, in the beam of his flashlight, he could see this gray creature up in the trees, and is covered in matted, spotted hair, like there's just patchy hair all over this thing's body. And his first thought went to that it was an emaciated bear. It was a bear with mange. And really, it's no different than any other bear, but for some reason, looking at it, it just strikes this fear into Robert, and he cannot help but just hold his light and stare at this thing, when all of a sudden he starts to notice that something about this bear just is not right. He could tell that this thing did not have ears of a bear, it did not have the build of a bear, and more importantly, its head shape just did not match a bear. It had its head kind of turned away from him, but he could tell just by the look of the side and back of this thing's head that it just did not match a bear. When all of a sudden this thing starts to turn its head, looks directly down at Robert, And that's when he notices that this thing is not a bear. This thing almost has more of a humanoid type face. It has a flat face. It does not have a snout. It has sunken in eyes. It has a massive mouth. And this thing has these glowing yellow eyes that just seem to glow from the beam of his light. And this thing's looking directly down at him. It's just not breaking its stare on him. Robert at this point just yells out for Tom. He just yells, "Tom, get out here!" When all of a sudden, this thing up in the tree mimicked exactly what he said. At this point, Robert's completely terrified, and his first reaction was just to quickly whip his rifle up. He dropped his flashlight, he whipped his rifle up, fired a shot at this thing in the tree. When all of a sudden, this thing just lets out this blood-curdling scream, and you could hear it actually jump from the one tree over to another, over to another. He could hear the branches breaking. You hear branches falling to the ground. He hears Tom come running out of the trailer. Tom's yelling for Robert. Robert yells back to Tom, "I'm over here. There's something up in the trees." Tom comes running over to him. Now both of them, they have their guns up. Tom has no idea what's going on. He just can see that Robert is absolutely terrified. He's heard Robert shoot. So he's holding his rifle up. Robert's holding his rifle up. And they could hear the sound of sticks breaking up in the trees, going basically in a circle around them the entire time. This thing is just letting out these really high-pitched squeals. Both men, even though Tom had not seen this thing, he could hear whatever this is moving around up in the trees, screaming, and he is completely terrified. And Robert, at this point, he's almost inconsolably terrified. He's completely shaking. And just periodically, as he could hear branches breaking, he's popping rounds off up into the trees, which was completely not like him. He was a very big stickler for gun safety, but he was just so scared in this moment, and he did not know what else to do except for fire at this creature. It's basically a form of self-defense. This went on for a couple of minutes until they could hear whatever this was start to move away from their camp. At this point, Tom reaches over, he grabs onto Robert, tries to calm him down and asks him, like, what happened? What was that? What the hell was that? What was screaming at us? Like, what was up in these trees? And Robert told him exactly what he saw. Tom, even though he did not see it, he knew that Robert was completely terrified and completely out of character this entire time, and he had never heard anything make that sound before. So Tom just immediately believed Robert. Both men, they did not know what to do at this point. They just ended up making their way back into the trailer, and they spent that entire night basically sitting up with their rifles just in case whatever the hell that thing was came back. The next morning, they made a call to the Department of Natural Resources, and a short time later, a vehicle pulled up to their camp. A guy got out of the vehicle, but he was not dressed like a typical DNR or conservation officer, but he did identify himself as being the field supervisor, explaining that a lot of his officers were busy because it was the hunting season, and asked them what had happened. When the cousins told him what happened, this officer's reaction was not what they expected. This guy just basically said to them, "Forget about what you saw, it was a bear." Both cousins kind of looked at each other like, what the hell is this guy talking about? And they pushed back at him. They said, no, like, this was definitely not a bear. Like, we know bears, this was not a bear. And this officer looked at them and said, no, forget about what you saw, it was a bear. Both cousins, again, they just pressed at this officer that this was not a bear. And this officer actually ended up citing Robert with discharging a firearm after legal hours. After telling him that he was citing him for this, he said, keep it up and I'm going to cite you for shooting at a bear without a tag. Robert at this point, even though he wanted to push back against this officer, he didn't want to have a poaching charge added to him for no reason at all. So he just basically shut his mouth and just basically said, yeah, you know what, you're right, it was a bear. This officer apparently, after he said that, said, good, I'm glad you understand, turned around, headed back to his vehicle, and left. Both cousins have no idea what the hell it was that they encountered out on their property. They still do go out there. But whenever they go out hunting, they make sure that they're together up in a double stand. They don't separate. And one thing they do now is they use the washroom inside the trailer. Well, that's it for today's encounter. Let me know your thoughts. Tell me, what do you think they encountered out on their property? Was this some type of rake, some type of skinwalker, some type of Windigo type creature? As well, let me know your thoughts on that officer's reaction. I really want to know your thoughts on that part specifically, just because that type of behavior just seems incredibly odd. But as always, thanks for joining us. And again, if you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to slam that notification bell. And also, don't forget to check out the podcast. There'll be a link in the description below for that. And I'll see you next time.